Hi, I'm Mark Dickey from JMC Academy. This is just going to be an introductory level tutorial explaining texture maps for 3D rendering. We're going to look at a couple of different maps, all based around this simple texture of bricks, but we're looking at this both for animation and for games. So what we're looking at here are basically the 6 most common maps you'll see. So we've got a color map that is simply a photo. It's just straightforward. This has had some of the depth information removed from it, so it's a little bit flatter than a regular photo. But it is essentially just a straight diffuse color texture map. So it's probably the most basic level. This one is an ambient occlusion map. This is typically used in games primarily. You can use any of these in both rendering, in animation, as well as for games. But really what this is doing is creating an extra sense of depth. This would probably be a stronger map if we had darker shading inside these sort of grout in between the tiles. At the moment it is creating an extra bit of depth, but essentially ambient occlusion, the idea of it is any two objects that are close to each other need to be creating a bit of shadow. If you were to look at an object somewhere in the room around you right now, perhaps your keyboard, and you'll see just a little bit of shadow just underneath the keyboard. Anytime two objects are close to each other, they create that little bit of shadow, and an ambient occlusion map is essentially a way to sort of simulate that sort of soft shadow interaction. This one is a bump map, so you might be familiar with the previous tutorial where we went over creating an orange. So a bump map is creating the fine gritty bump detail. Now, somewhat similar to a bump map, this one is a displacement map, and the way this works is at render time. So it's not for real-time rendering in games, it's just for animation. At render time, the higher colors, the lighter colors, are actually projected away from the geometry, creating new geometry, extra detail. And so this sort of texture map with the dark shadows and the higher highlights allow us to turn a very flat 2D image like this into something with depth. So you can see the impression of bricks coming out. I'll just point out this isn't a fancy render whatsoever. This is just the standard Maya software renderer. This tutorial is not a rendering tutorial. We just want to take a look at the different texture maps and understand how they work. So that one was displacement, that pushes out the detail. Now the next one is a normal map. This is essentially a variation of a bump map, but instead of just using the grayscale to create depth, we're using RGB values, red, green, blue. And the reason we're seeing so much blue and purple in this map is because the blue represents depth. And so in a real-time renderer, such as Unity, a game engine, the extra blue details are used to push out that resolution, that texture. So we can see inside of Unity, we have this brick texture with this normal map applied to it, and it creates a bit of a sense of depth. As we move the texture, there's just a little bit of movement in the shadows as we move the camera. It's probably a bit more obvious at this sort of angle. You can see the shadowing happening on the edges of bricks, which is completely an illusion. This is just a 2D plane, one quad, so it's very low resolution in terms of polygon count. The other thing we're seeing here is this shine. Now I've turned this up a little bit, so it's creating a bit of a sort of plasticky, almost like a wet brick kind of effect, and we can turn that down in our shader, so we can get rid of that. But basically this one is coming from the Specular Map, and this is what we see. The Specular Map is this black and white image. So jumping back to Photoshop is our final texture. This black and white image creates the specular highlights, which is the sheen, the shiny section of a material. So let's take a quick look at some materials inside of Maya and in Unity, how these are assembled, and then we'll jump into actually creating each one of these. And I'm just going to quickly set up this texture so you can see what it's doing before we go through and actually create each one of those maps. So in Hypershade, you open Hypershade with this button up here. I've created a blend texture. So we'll just clear that just to demonstrate. Delete that altogether. If I had something open, so here's an existing shader network. Don't be alarmed, it's just a collection of nodes. This is just a way to visualize the different nodes plugging into each other. I can just clear that. And I'll point out I'm using the Maya software renderer. Typically in JMC Academy we'll be using the RenderMan renderer quite extensively, especially in animation as you go through. It's a very high quality renderer, but it's worth taking a look at different renderers. So we'll also use the Arnold renderer. You may want to play around with that. It comes as standard in 2017 in Maya. In Arnold, probably the AI standard shader would be the shader that you'd be using. So if I went to my render settings and if I change this to Arnold, I'd need to set up an Arnold shader. If I changed it to RenderMan, that Arnold shader would be no good. I'd need to use a RenderMan material, and probably this Pixar surface is a really good one to go with. But for this tutorial, we're not using either of those. We're using the just boring old Maya software renderer because it's just so simple and easy to understand. So I'll get rid of those. Don't want that one. Just clean this up a little bit. Just be aware to your Lambert 1, that's the default material. Never use that to change anything. Everything new that you make in Maya will be applied, have this standard material applied to it. So in Maya, we're getting rid of Arnold and RenderMan. In Maya, we're just clicking on Maya and making a blend. So blend 2 is the name of this blend. We can see here, blend 2. So I'm middle click dragging that onto my model. So if we take a look at the specular highlight, if I move the light, move the camera angle so that the light is shining on the object, you can really see what that specular highlight is doing. And you can see it on the little symbol here too, and also this preview. Now what I want to do is plug into the specular color a file. So I'll click File. Now I can click on that folder and I can load my specular texture map. So we can see now file 5 is what I'm looking at, which is this one, file 5. And so now when I move, you can just make out some specular highlight from the bricks. So it's really okay. So I've got the specular highlight. If I click on the file, the actual file 5, which is my specular map, I can just increase the exposure if I want, and that'll really show the effect of that specular highlight. So you can clearly see how that is working. As we see the shine, that texture map is really coming through. So that's how the specular works, which is this one. So let's take a look at the bump map applied, which is this texture. And to apply the bump map, I'm coming back to my Blend 2 shader, scrolling down to where it says bump mapping, click on the file, or this little node input option, and the node that I want to add is a file. So this takes me to the settings, and you can see what they are. Bump 2D is this node. Now I know from experience that the bump depth at 100% is usually too strong, and so you typically will just pull that back a little bit. I usually start around about 0.3 or so. You don't need to be too precise. But what I want to do is go to the file input, so I can click on this arrow, which has taken me to file 6, which we can see is this texture here, this node here. So I could have, if I was on this bump 2D, instead of clicking this, I could have also just clicked on this file. same thing. And what I want to do in file 6 is load up the file. This is the bump map that's going into the bump node. And so this is my bump, PNG. And so you can see that bump file goes into the bump node, which goes into the blend shader. And you can see what that does is create this extra bit of fine detail. And together with the Specular Map, it's a pretty cool effect. Of course, with grey it doesn't look very interesting, so let's select that node again, the blend, and we'll add colour. I could actually just add colour like this if I didn't have a texture that I was happy with. I could sort of try to pick something and play around with the settings, but it's much better to add an actual texture. So in the colour, once again we'll click on the input node and add a file, and it goes straight to the file that I've just selected. Click on the folder to load my colour, which in this case I've saved as a JPEG, but you are better off using a PNG. I think it's a better format to work with. It's a nice compromise between quality and compression. Okay, so loading this texture, and of course we see that straight away. So it's starting to look pretty good. It looks quite nice really, especially in this viewport renderer. So this is a real-time renderer, not unlike Unity, where we're rendering in real time. I don't need to pre-render to see this. Now, using the software renderer, just double checking what render I've got is my software. If I render at the moment, you can see the result is quite overblown with light. What's going on here is if I turn on my light, I haven't got any lights in the scene. So let's just quickly make... So that was basically rendering with the Maya default lights. So I'm just going to make a simple light setup. I'll make a spotlight. And a nice way to position spotlights is to look through them. So with that light selected, I can go Panel, Look Through Selected, and just position this how I want. It's pretty weird looking through a light, but it works. And I'll just make it a bit larger and get some fall off. That's fine. So that's the light shining how I want it. And so I'll do a quick render. And so you can see from that render, it looks a little bit better with a nice light with a fall off, but of course using the Maya software renderer, to be honest, it's not that nice, especially compared to something like RenderMan, which is just beautiful. But it's a good starting point to understand rendering. And in any case, the only reason I'm rendering is I want to show you displacement maps. So back to Photoshop, we can see the displacement map is this lighter and darker one. Now this is pretty much just for animation, because it actually increases the geometry in your model, which means it's no good for games. The game engines generally don't support displacement maps. We can see here the shader network I've built is starting to get a little bit complex, and it's a bit weird that it brings the light in. If you ever end up confused, if you've got nodes sort of all over the place and it's getting a bit hard to follow and it's kind of messy, especially if you've accidentally done something like this and made an extra one, sometimes this will happen and it goes flying off. You can always just reset it by selecting the shader you're working with, holding down the right mouse, graph network. It's all cleanly laid out for you. With the blend too, so we've been working with all these settings. The final one is actually the shader group. So this blend comes into the shader group, and it's this displacement map. So again, this won't do anything in the real-time renderer, in the viewport. It will apply the displacement at render time. So I'm going to click here, once again, load a file. Now, just because of I'm familiar with this. I know that the scale is usually an issue. I might just pull that back to about 0.3 and test that out. But what I want to do is plug in the map into this node. So I'll click on this, which takes me to this folder, displacements, hit OK. And I'll just zoom in a little bit. I'll also lower the camera because these will be coming out, so it's a bit more effective at this sort of angle. And hit render. Okay, and there's the result. That's definitely overblown, so I'll probably want to reduce that scale a little bit. So let's just take a quick look. And coming back to the shader group, this one at the very end. And it's this displacement map, which is taking me to file 8. So I couldn't remember which file it was just by going to the shader group and navigating. It's taking me to this file 8. And it's the input, which is the displacement shader. So I'll reduce that a little. A big part of the problem is actually not the scale so much as the fact I've got the camera right up in front of the model. Typically it would be more like this sort of distance. And we can see here the benefit of a tileable texture. If I turn off isolate, you can see the other textures I've got. I'll just grab that light and pull it out a little. All of these materials that I've got, there's quite a few. I've just duplicated that one texture. I'm just going to apply to selection. And so you can see the way these tile together seamlessly to make it look like one giant texture. So if we look at it from a little bit further away like this, and we do a render, let's see how that looks. Okay, so there's the result. And you can definitely see the effect of the displacement map pulling those bricks out. And like I said, it's just a nasty, quick Maya software render. If you wanted to play around with Arnold or RenderMan using their specific shaders, you should be able to get some really nice results. And certainly if you spent some time actually setting up some decent lighting. But that's not the point of this tutorial. We're just taking a look at these texture maps. So let's see how this now works in a real-time renderer. So this one's very simple. I'm just going to make a brand new material. Bricks 02 and apply it. And so we're only using 4 shaders, the specular, the normal map. It's important actually with a normal map that you've set it to normal. By default it'll be like a texture that's set to default. Just going to apply that to demonstrate what happens if it's not set up. Our color and the ambient occlusion. So we're working to this. If I apply the normal map, actually I'll start with the spec just to show you that working. Now we can see straight away there's a problem. There's no specular channel. The reason for that is in Unity, when you add a map, it gives you the option of using the standard shader or the standard with the specular setup. So because we're not adding a metallic map, we're adding a specular map, you need to change it to specular setup, which gives us the option. So I can plug in the specular. We can see straight away what that's doing, especially if I move this light. It'll be more obvious too if we just increase the smoothness of that shader. So that's the specular working. We'll add the normal map. Now this is not set to a normal, which would happen anytime you just brought that straight in. So if I add the normal map, it just says this is not marked as a normal map, fix now. So I click that button and it's a normal map. And you can really see the detail there as I turn it. It's creating shadows to give the impression of all that extra detail. The color just goes into our albedo, gives us our color, and the AO, which is the black and white one, goes into occlusion, so AO for ambient occlusion. And that was quite a subtle effect, mainly because I didn't make this dark enough, to be honest. That's could be a lot darker to push that grout. But that's the real-time renderer. And so that's just a quick overview of what these different shaders, different materials do. So now we'll jump into Photoshop, starting with this texture, and we'll go through actually creating each one of these. Okay, I'm going to start with this photo. Now this is from cgtextures.com. Using textures from online sources is a great way to start, and it can be very useful if you quickly want to get textures together, but ultimately you will be wanting to create your own textures. So you could take a photo of a brick wall like this. The problem is the lighting is quite critical, and we can see we've got some shadowing up here and there's a bit of shadowing down the bottom. Now we'll address that through the texturing process, but to start with we're just using this texture from an online source. Now I'm going to start by cropping, go to my crop tool, and I'll just change the ratio to square, and I'll bring down the top section to be roughly in the middle of these line of bricks, and the same with the bottom. Let's go about there and hit enter. So this is our starting point. At the moment this won't tile correctly. This side won't match up with this side. So what we can do to fix that is to offset it. So if we go filter, other, offset, and all we want to do, if we knew the exact size, we could just type in exactly half. So if it was a 1024, we could type in 512. But you can see there when I move it, you're getting this section where the texture wraps around, and you can see they don't align. But what this does do is these textures on the side, these pixels along the side here and here, perfectly align with each other, because it's simply offsetting, moving this texture across, and it's wrapping around itself. So as long as we have our seam here in the middle for the vertical, and here roughly in the center, that's fine. And then what we do is clean that up. We just want to hide this. So if I hit Control plus, that lets me zoom in and out in Photoshop, I'm going to zoom in and you can see the issues with this texture. So a really good tool for cleaning this up is the clone stamp. This one, a little stamp icon, clone stamp tool. Now with this you want to, I'm just hitting the square bracket to make the cursor fairly small. You don't want to have it too large. And how this works is that when I hold down the Alt key, it samples a section. So I'll sample just here, actually just here. And you can see as I move my cursor away, it's got that little icon, that little few pixels that were inside it mimicked. And so now wherever I move my brush, when I click, it draws that over it. I might just turn the opacity right up 100%. And it's just a matter of going through and cleaning up these areas. You want to be careful not to overdo it. So here I'll just sort of get rid of all of that. And for this corner, let's sample over here. I'll just clean that bit up a little. For that corner up the top, let's try this, so a bit of an orange color. Actually, that's fine. Trying to just be mindful of overdoing it. With here, what I want to do is blend these colors, so I'm just going to turn the opacity down a little. So I'm on about 70% there, and just go through. So I'm not clicking and dragging, I'm doing multiple clicks to try to get a somewhat even kind of dispersal. Alright, so that roughly cleans up a little section there. It's about done. Let's see what I actually want for this bit, maybe that sort of color. Okay, so this one brick here I'll call done. That's about it. Now it's a matter of going through this whole lot in the same way. And so when I finish this, zooming out, you can see that's not so noticeable. I could use a bit of cleanup. I could probably turn the opacity down and maybe sample something from over here to just get a little bit more of that blending happening. Just undo it when you accidentally get something you don't want. So holding down Alt, clicking that and painting away. And that's the process. So I'll pause the video, but what we need to do now is go right through each brick, and probably take around about 15 minutes, so it's not too bad. It's a little bit tedious, but it's worth doing to get a nice clean looking texture. So I'll let you go for that and restart the video once you've completed your section. Okay, so I've gone right through the vertical and the horizontal and cleaned those up as I demonstrated. That's probably taken a bit under 10 minutes, so it wasn't too time consuming to give me my own texture, and that could easily be something that was based on a photo. One thing to point out is just remember at the very edges you're trying to make these match. This side needs to match this side, so you just don't want to make too many changes. Just keep your cursor in the center and select from the center with that clone stamp tool. Now, just to show you why we've done this, if I jump to Maya, here I've got a plane that I've created, and it's just a single plane there. If I duplicate that, that is this texture applied to this plane, and of course it duplicates completely seamlessly. So you just can't tell where those two seams are if we turn on the shaded edges. We come down to the middle down here. It's quite a seamless transition, hence the term seamless texture. So this is really useful, of course. We can sit there and build an entire brick wall, or cobble tile stones, or any sort of repeating tileable texture. So it's a very important skill for both animation and games. Now there's just a couple more things we should really do to this. Ideally, before we can move on, we could use this. It does work, as we just saw inside of Maya. But one thing is the lighting is just a little bit uneven. There's sections where it's just a little bit brighter and darker. It's very subtle. Most beginners probably wouldn't really notice it and consider it to be a problem, but I think it is worth cleaning up. So I'm just going to right click on the background here to duplicate the layer. So we're working non-destructive. We're working on a new layer. We can do anything we want to it, and the original layer is still there. So on this layer, I'm going into Filter, Other, and I'm using the High Pass filter. And I'll turn the radius up a fair bit, usually somewhere around 75 or so seems to be okay. And so now with that applied, I'm going into Edit, and I want to fade the high pass. So with this, I'm going to change the mode. Click on this and choose the one at the very bottom, luminosity, and hit OK. And so that's done on this copy layer. If we turn it off, you can see the difference. Very subtle, but it's just a little bit more even, pops a bit more nicely. Okay, I'm going to I'll just get rid of this background layer. I don't actually want that now. And I'm going to save this in the project that I'm working in. So obviously you've made a folder where you'd want to be calling, saving all your work to the one folder. I'm calling this base, so brick underscore, so everything in my project will be brick, and I'm making this the base. And this is a Photoshop file. So basically that's my starting point. Now from here, what I'm going to do is duplicate this a few times. Duplicate layer. I'll call this one bump. Duplicate layer, and I'll call this one spec. And just to be non-destructive, I'll call this one color, or diffuse rather, which is, you can think of that as your color. So this is the background, is we've always have this to come back to. And this is our diffuse, this is done. I could do a bit of color correction, but for now we'll just leave that and move forwards. What we want to do is make a bump map. With the bump layer selected, what I want to do is we're creating a grayscale map for bumpiness in 3D. And what we really want to do is make all the grout, the lighter colored sections in here, we want to make that dark so that that stays back, and then the bricks are a lighter color and they pop forwards more. So what we need to do is select all of the grout. There's various ways we can go about this. What I'm going to do is demonstrate using under the select menu, go down to color range. So basically I'm going to select all of the light colors by color. So quick selection, select color range, and I'll just Control plus to zoom in. And what this does is I use the selection eyedropper to pick the bits I want. So by default this should be showing you none. If you come down to quick mask, it's just a bit easier to see what you want to see. Now if I hold down shift, I can add, you can see that changes to the plus like this. I can add to the selection, and so I just want to select these little bits in here, just being careful not to get too much. But that looks like about what I want. Everything that's this grout color has been selected, so I'll hit OK. Alright, with everything selected, I'm going into select and then select and mask. On the side here, this brings up the refine edge settings. So if we change this to overlay, this refine edge used to be its own setting. Now it's under set and mask. Select and mask. So with overlay, if you increase the shift edge above 0, you'll see the red gradually increasing compared to down here. We're getting too much back in. So I'll increase this a little bit, and we'll just turn up the smooth, maybe about 20 or so. Bit of feathering, just a couple of pixels of feathering. Yeah, okay, that's more obvious what we're doing. So you can see as I increase that, it's shrinking. I actually want to go the other way and just slightly go over the bricks. So that looks better. About -15, and I'm going to smooth that a little bit again. Probably don't need to feather it too much. Half a pixel or so. Okay, I'll just zoom out so we can see I've got all of the bricks selected on this bump layer. I'm just going to duplicate this layer and add a layer mask on this duplicated layer. This button here, it's a picture of a layer with a mask in the middle. I'll click that to make a layer mask. If I just turn off everything else, we can see what we end up with. Thanks to having those bricks selected when I made that mask, that's masked out all of the bricks so we can just see the background. Now what I'm going to do is invert this by hitting Control I. So we're just seeing the bricks. Now I'll select the layer underneath and make a new layer, and giving us a layer directly underneath this one with the mask. And on this blank layer, I'm just going to fill this black. Grab the paint bucket tool and fill that black. And so that's giving us obviously very black sections where we used to have a light color. And so the lighter colors of the bricks will be popping more in our bump map than the background. So this mask is selected, and then using either black or white, what I'm going to do is paint. Now if I hit X, that's reverting it, so I'm painting in white, and so the white removes, just undoing that, and the black masks to reveal this layer underneath it. So what I want to do is paint black. I'm just going to pick a softer brush with a bit of fall off and turn the opacity down a little. I just want to paint out a couple of minor. Okay, so above this layer, I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and add a HueSaturation layer. And on this saturation layer, we're going to pull the saturation right down. Back onto the bricks layer. I'm going to double click the actual layer here to bring up the layer styles. And I just want to go into color overlay. So a white overlay is what I want. So the bricks are much whiter now, completely white at the moment, but if I turn the opacity down, that brings the bricks back through. I'd say about 40% looks okay. And finally, I want to bring in a bit of the detail from the grout back into behind the black. So I'm just going to the black layer and turning the opacity down. 50% is a bit much. Let's go somewhere around here. Just a little bit of texture detail, maybe 75. Yep. I might just go into the settings for this layer settings, into the color overlay. I'll actually increase this a bit, up to around about 70. So you can see what that's doing, making these quite white. What I'm going to do is actually make this not a bump map. I'm going to make it a displacement map and just demonstrate how you use displacement maps in Maya 2017. I'm just going to use Arnold, the default renderer in 2017. I definitely prefer RenderMan. Is a much more powerful, very nice renderer. It's quite effective. I think RenderMan's probably the way you should be going as much as possible if you can, but since Arnold is the default renderer in 2017, it's probably worth demonstrating how that works. And I'd like to show you displacement mapping. So I've set this layer to about half, 50%, and the layer style in the color overlay is about 70% on this, which technically isn't a bump map, it's a displacement map. So save this. I'm saving as a PNG, and I'm saving this one as brick underscore displace for displacement. And you can see here's one I've saved earlier. Now, before I move on, I'm also going to make a bump map. So with this, double clicking this actual layer, we'll come back into the layer styles, into the color overlay. We'll turn this right down to probably about 20% or so. And this layer, this black layer, will really push this down. So we're getting this, the detail in the grout here between the bricks. So this is going to be our bump map, which will create all the fine detail. And I might just go into the HueSaturation layer. And I'll just desaturate this layer a little bit. Make it a little bit darker. That's probably fine. Save as PNG brick bump. And here's one I've already saved, so I'll just cancel out of that. So you've got a bump and a displace. Now the final map that would be worth doing is a specular map. On the layer down here, I'm going to make a new layer, a new adjustment layer. So we'll come down to layer, new adjustment layer, levels. And essentially with this, you're looking at where the bulk of the data is. Most of the data, most of the information for the majority of the pixels on this layer are right in the center. So if we can basically, at least that's the best way to think about it, if we basically move these sliders, you can see it's really making the contrast pop a lot more. I'm just going to chop off a bit of that through the middle here. I'll just bring the mids up a little so the whole thing's much darker, and we're getting a bit more of a sort of highlights around the top of the brick and darker down the bottom. And I'll also come back into the saturation level layer and make it even darker. You want your spec maps to be fairly dark, and that's about what we want. I might just come back to this layer actually and turn the opacity up a bit, not too much. Just I don't want too much shine in the grout there, so most of it's on the surface of the bricks. And we'll save this as PNG brick spec for specular highlights. So to create the normal map, we actually need a plugin. We could do what's called baking, texture baking, where we have a high poly model and we bake the detail of that onto a low poly model to create a normal map. But what we're actually going to do here is photo conversion, and we're going to use a program called Quixel. So we have that at JMC Academy. Just go into your start menu and find Quixel. It's a Photoshop plugin, and what we want is the N for Endo. So I'm going to click on that, which opens up Endo. And this is all on top of Photoshop. Just make sure you've got the color map. And with the color selected, I'm just going to click this big button, which turns a photo into a normal. So I click the button. It does a bunch of processing in the background. Actually, not so much in the background. And that's created a normal map. You can just play around with the sliders to see how that's working. But you're not really going to know how that looks unless you look at it in 3D, which is what the 3 button's for. 3D, I'll click on that. And that opens up the 3D viewer. And I can just orbit around. And what I can see by looking at this is the bricks appear to be pushing in the wrong direction. They're kind of pushing inwards, which you can see from here. So I might just change this button slant to down. And you can see this is updated. And it looks much better. You can just play around with these settings a little bit. But basically, once you're happy with it, save that out as a normal map, PNG. So brick underscore normal. Now, once you've made this inside of Quixel, you'll see you have all these layers inside of Photoshop. That means it's a live Quixel project. I actually don't want that, so I'm just going to collapse these by going Layer, Flatten Image. That just flattens it all into the one. And you can see this now changes when I hover over with the cursor. And finally, what I'm going to do is using Quixel, convert the normal map into an ambient occlusion map. So this little pull down menu, I'll go to Map Converter. And what this is saying is I'm inputting a normal map from the background here, and I'm converting it to an ambient occlusion. I could make all of these others. I could even let it attempt a specular map, but I'm going to go ambient occlusion, and then this is the go button. This just converts it. So I click on that one. And there's my ambient occlusion. Just play around with the settings. Once I'm happy, I can flatten that image. If I want, I can actually finish with Quixel. If I want, I can come in and add a adjustment, maybe levels, and tweak that texture as much as I want. And save that one out as an ambient occlusion. PNG. And that's the right file there, ambient occlusion. And so that's it. That's how we go about creating all of these textures. And basically now refer to the start of the video where I demonstrated how to set those up. And that gives you a quick overview of how these different materials work. But the idea is that you can now go forth and create your own texture maps to create interesting materials for 3D renders. Hope that was educational for you, and we'll see you in the next tutorial. Cheers.